Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and I appreciate you joining me today. Now, I have to warn you, if you are on a vegan diet, there is going to be a considerable amount of red meat in today's program, but I would encourage you to pull up a chair, make yourself comfortable, and be prepared to bump into the limits of your mental universe, depending on how well you understand some of the issues. I thought I'd stick with something fairly safe today, since gun control is a major topic right now, and there are different individuals at all levels, from local right on up to the federal level, pushing to enact greater gun control. And I've been in the arena on this for a long time. I've had strong opinions on this for a long time. But I want to share with you an op-ed that was published in the Times News. This was published earlier today by an editorialist by the name of Linda Brugger. Now, I want to make very clear, as I share this editorial and her take on, guns kill people, or people with guns kill people, actually is the name of the editorial. I want to make very clear that it is not Linda herself that I wish to call into question. I'm going to take some very pointed shots at some of the ideas that she's promoting, some of the ideals, and some of the untruths or half-truths or simply misinformed rhetoric that is being passed around as informed debate when it comes to this issue. But above all, I want you to understand, I don't know Linda personally. As far as I know, she is a person who loves her country. She probably loves her family, the people around her. I think she's probably operating from a standpoint of, I don't want to see people hurt. I don't want to see tragedy. Unfortunately, she is buying into a very destructive and unproductive way to go about making that happen. So let's take a look at her editorial. We're going to break this down just little by little. It starts by informing us that tomorrow night the nation will watch in a thoughtfully produced primetime special. I guess only the MSM can produce things so thoughtfully. A synopsis to date of the investigation into why a mob attacked the U.S. Capitol to stop verifying the 2020 election results. All right. Let's start with a correction on what was this mob that attacked the U.S. Capitol? There was certainly a group of people who found their way to the Capitol in terms of the protest. How much of that group was actually a mob? And how many of those people who actually showed up there who were chanting and were upset with what was deemed or what was believed to be inconsistencies, perhaps fraudulent behavior, or just simply things that didn't add up in the 2020 election? I don't think anybody really knows those numbers exactly. We do know that there was a small number of people who definitely moved to break into the Capitol and to instigate people entering the Capitol. But to say that, well, the reason they were there was to stop the verifying of the 2020 election results, those results weren't being verified. The votes of the Electoral College were being tabulated and cast. But as far as verifying the votes, that's something that's actually been taking place, for pretty much the last year and a half. And if you haven't seen 2,000 Mules by Dinesh D'Souza, you might be surprised how many things are hinky in the verification of how above board the 2020 election was. I'm not saying that I know categorically, it was absolutely stolen, but I am saying there are enough inconsistencies that it deserves a much closer look, and it deserves much closer analysis. But see, we weren't even supposed to think about that, much less question it. So to say that, they were just trying to stop the verification, there was no verification going on at the Capitol that day. The certification of the electoral votes was taking place. And yes, there were some people who were saying it was the duty of Vice President Pence to stop and to refuse to certify some of those votes that were in question. That's something that still could be playing out. I'm not saying the election's going to be overturned, but I'm saying the questions that have come to the surface since then make it very clear. We do not have all the answers, and in no way has this thing been satisfactorily resolved. All the more so indicated by the fact that we're not even supposed to acknowledge it. Moving on. Anyone who watched, she says, saw that the instigators of the physical breach of the building had guns. Okay, pump the brakes there, sister. What's this we stuff? Where did you see this? And could you provide any kind of documentation, any sort of resource that would actually show this? Because I've watched many hours of video, and there's still another 14,000 hours of video that the Capitol Police are sitting on that they haven't released. The only guns that I saw in evidence that day were those in the hands of Capitol Police officers. The only shot that was fired in anger was from a Capitol Police officer into Ashley Babbitt, who was one of the protesters. So I don't know if this is an intentional attempt to gaslight us. Maybe it's just, trying to run with something that I think I saw or I think the narrative would support. But I would very clearly defy Linda Brugger to show where exactly did you see? Where did anyone who watched see that the instigators of the physical breach of the building had guns? The instigators of that breach, by the way, did appear to have training. I mean, they were very different from the grandmas who were walking around waving flags in the Capitol building later on. But the ones who actually went up to the building, tangled with police, forced the breach into the building, there was something about the way they moved that spoke of training, serious training. They had economy of movement. They had purpose in everything they did. There was coordination in their movement. Not your average run-of-the-mill protesters who are just consumed with Trump lust and trying to turn our democracy on its head. Moving on. She says they could have killed someone. You think? I'm sure that most armed insurgents hoped that the gun would intimidate someone into submission before they used it to inflict harm. Again, there is no evidence. At least there has been nothing shown that, yes, these were armed insurgents and they were the ones who forced their way in. Now, I'm open to correction. If someone can show me otherwise, please do so. Next, she moves on to talking about concern over people being able to buy guns without government permission, noting that people are holding estate sales or selling their collected guns all over this country without reporting the sale, to which I would ask, why should they? You see, the gun is nothing more than a lawfully owned piece of private property, and unless someone in officialdom, someone in law enforcement has probable cause to suspect a specific person of a specific crime, it's none of their business. Now, that may sound scary for people who have control issues and who don't want to ponder the possibility of something taking place without their knowledge or without their authorization. But the fact of the matter is, that's how it was prior to the Gun Control Act of 1968. And it's not the problem that it's made out to be. People have bought, sold, and horse-traded guns for many, many years, and almost never will you find those guns used in a crime. A black market certainly exists, but that's another story. We'll get back to that in a few moments. She says some buyers will merely add a unique firearm to their collection, while others will find buyers willing to pay more money for a weapon to use criminally. That's the black market part I was telling you about. And by the way, making it illegal to purchase a gun, do you think it's going to work as well as when we made drugs illegal and everybody stopped doing them and buying them and selling them because it was illegal to do so? Look, if there's a need, there's going to be someone providing for that need. And the thing you don't want to do is convert a very large section of the society into criminals by taking away legal avenues for them to engage in commerce with one another. And I'm talking about guns here, not drugs. The entire enterprise of private gun sales is largely untaxed. Yeah. Again, if you don't think we're taxed enough in all the other areas of our life, and what do you want? People to collect sales tax? You want them to pay some kind of a privilege tax? Look, any sporting equipment, any outdoors equipment, people are already paying numerous excise taxes from the time of manufacture through its purchase, to the original owner. It's not a matter of it being untaxed. I know the National Firearms Act of 1934 sought to control short-barreled shotguns and machine guns through a $200 tax, with the belief that $200 was just way too expensive for anybody to possibly afford. But that tax is still there, and that's, when people, if you remember the Randy Weaver episode from back in 1992, the whole reason the feds went after him was because he was accused of sawing off the barrel of a shotgun just a little bit too short. And the crime that they went after him for was he didn't pay the tax to have the stamp to make that acceptable in the government's eyes. And no one bothers with background checks. And again, why should they? Now look, if someone comes up to me out of breath on the street and offers to sell me a television, I have enough common sense to think, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Gun owners and people who sell firearms on a private basis can make that same determination. I have bought, sold, and horse traded enough firearms in my life that I'm cautious and I'm careful about the people that I would sell them to. And if something felt off, if something seemed a little bit out of sorts, I reserve the right to say, nope, not going to do it. She then goes on to talk about the 18-year-old who massacred children in Texas and used an AR-15 to kill. His action gave him the belief that he could make a name for himself before he died. He had asked and answered any questions about whether he should use his weapon. I've read this probably a dozen times, and I'm still not sure exactly what this is supposed to be saying. So if I could have a side of ranch dressing with this word salad, that would help, but I'm really not sure what that's supposed to mean. The first two incidents she says that she cited are examples of why the NRA and other gun lobbyists have opposed regulation on the sale of guns. But the third is an example of why the purchaser must be scrutinized. Now, people who make this kind of a statement typically don't have much experience in what it takes to purchase a firearm. And I'm not saying that, they're bad for that. I'm just saying they're not drawing from any kind of life experience or real world experience in how many hoops you have to jump through. You have to have a state approved ID. You have to be able to pass a background check. In some states, if you have a current concealed carry license, that's enough to show that, okay, this is a person in good standing. But it's hardly the free for all. This is not, some open arms bazaar, like in Kandahar. This is still a very highly regulated activity. Now, she says the individuals who stand at the ready to violently oppose any government mandate they disagree with want their arsenals kept secret. However, they don't mind using assault weapons to show how serious they are in any protest. All right, let's make our minds up here. Are they violent and trying to keep this secret so that they have these guns to turn to someday when they are disagreeing with a government mandate, or are they openly showing these guns to show government that they mean business? I don't think you can have it both ways. And as far as the idea that these individuals stand at the ready to violently oppose any government mandate, for some reason it seems impossible for the people who are promoting gun control to recognize how violent government itself can be. It doesn't take a lot of history research to figure out that if you look at the major genocides of the 20th century, one common thread that you will find in every one of those genocides, and I can think of about 8 of them off the top of my head, to the tune of roughly 200 million people murdered by government. I mean, this is more than any gang or any lone wolf or even any militia has ever done. Nobody kills like government. And the one common thread in every one of those tragedies was that the targeted population was first disarmed by law. So let's not pretend that that government is, somehow it's this warm, fluffy thing that's going to just take care of us and protect us. Government sometimes becomes violent, and it is necessary sometimes for the people to be able to show parity of force and to be able to resist that violence. I can think of a couple of examples of countries that previously had a very clear right to keep and bear arms that since have taken that right from their people. Australia comes to mind. Canada comes to mind. Great Britain comes to mind. All you have to do is look at the way that they treated their citizens during the COVID lockdowns, putting people in camps against their will, forcibly vaccinating them against their will, taking away their property, taking away their jobs. Kind of makes you wonder if they would have been as brutal to them if they had the opportunity or if they had the means to resist. She says the private militia movement inspires the lone wolf domestic terrorist to act. Well, I'm going to use the example of Timothy McVeigh because oftentimes he was used, the guy who blew up the federal building in 1995 in Oklahoma City. He was given an example of, well, see, this is what the militia movement, produces. But you know where Timothy McVeigh got his training to create and use explosives? It was in the United States Army. And he was tied up with some pretty interesting people, not the least of whom were federal agents. But we still don't have the full story on that. It's interesting. A convenient narrative was constructed. The explanation was, well, he hung out with militia types, but that doesn't fully explain why he did what he did and where some of the other people involved in that mess disappeared to. She says after World War II, gun enthusiasts believed that the reason no one tried to invade the United States was the lethal arms stored in homes across the country. Well, No less than one of the Japanese leaders, I believe it was an admiral, who made the comment that to invade the mainland U.S. would be folly, because he said there would be a rifle behind every blade of grass. You can look to a similar response from the Nazis, who, for some reason, refused to invade Switzerland, which likewise had an armed citizenry of people who had access to arms and the will to use them. Now, she says that belief has morphed into a defense against an autocratic government, most commonly believed to be the design of Democrats. And I'll hand it to her here. Linda, it's not just the Democrats. The Republicans can pose just as big a threat to people's liberty as their Democratic counterparts. It's statism versus the rights of the individual. But then she says, earlier, hunters and sports shooters were happy to support a solid military defending the homeland. No, actually, that's not the case, because that military very seldom was where the people needed what needed to, or were, they were very seldom where the people were when that ability to defend oneself was required. Look at the taming of the West. Look at the taming of the frontiers. People moved westward. People had to make do for themselves. The purpose for the military was to defend the borders, to defend the nation's shorelines, through the Navy. But the right of the people and the responsibility of the people was to protect themselves, largely. She then says the actions of January 6th prove we cannot turn a blind eye toward private militias any longer. Trust me when I tell you, nobody has turned a blind eye. They've been a cuss word in the American lexicon for a long, long time, at least for the better part of the last 30 years. Family and acquaintances of a potential lone wolf must have the legal ability to enlist law enforcement and mental health experts to deter the individual who suddenly seeks the limelight by making a statement with a weapon. We already have laws that can do an involuntary commitment of a person for 72 hours if they are believed to pose a threat to themselves or others. I believe it's called the Baker Act. We don't need to expand this, and the reason for this expansion is not so much to protect people, from someone who's out there trying to make a statement. It's to expand the definition of who we can deprive of the right to keep and bear arms. She then says, while it's true that people using guns kill people, it's too easy to obtain a weapon for a person to use. According to whom? Who makes that determination that it's too easy? A young single mother who's had a meth head trying to kick down the door of her trailer. Is it too easy for her to get hold of something to defend herself and her children with? Who gets to make that call? She says law enforcement needs laws that allow them to legally confiscate a firearm when a person's mental state exhibits a desire to harm others or themselves. That is why red flag legislation is critically important. Any red flag legislation must include speedy recourse for anyone who believes it was misapplied. The problem with red flag legislation is that it inverts our system of justice. It puts the presumption of guilt in front of the presumption of innocence and requires the person to prove that they are, in fact, okay to still own their gun. So it will deprive them not only of the right to keep their arms, but it also deprives them of their private property, their lawfully owned private property, without due process. Now, you don't have to be an absolutist, you don't have to be an extremist to recognize that would be extremely prone to abuse, especially in a country where you have the president talking about the half of the country that didn't vote for him as some type of domestic extremists. How could anyone not see that this would be abused? She says, I've stated a preference for a national gun licensing procedure, or gun owner licensing procedure. It would permit all gun purchases by the license holder. It would include an up-to-the-minute database of those license holders who've lost privileges, and it would spell out the appeal process for denial or confiscation of the license. Law enforcement could legally seize weapons from someone with a suspended or canceled license. The word you need to focus on here is license and privilege, because we're talking about natural rights that are inherent in every living, breathing person being converted into a government-granted privilege. See, natural rights limit government's power over you. That's what makes them rights. Anything else is a cheap substitute. I'm not buying what's being sold here. Proven sale to someone without a license is illegal, or I think she's saying would be illegal. The background check for sales outside of a retail location is taken care of with the license. States could regulate the tax law. I mean, they do this already. Members of the military or law enforcement deemed eligible would receive their license upon discharge. A carry permit would exchange for a national license. The user fee would pay for the cost of the program. Again, this is already the case with concealed carry permits. Sellers would shed the burden of paperwork at the time of sale, except for entering the license number on the receipt. But the bottom line here is it's converting something into a government-granted privilege. You can't do that with a natural right. Would you be willing to do that with freedom of speech? Would you be willing to do that with your freedom of privacy? Your right to be safe and secure in your person, your papers, your home, your possessions? How about your right to a speedy trial? How about your right against self-incrimination? Do those need to be converted to privileges as well? This is not about controlling harm to people. This is about controlling people and making sure that they are subservient to whomever is in power at the moment. Finally, she says gun rights advocates correctly point to mental issues as the cause of all gun violence. Now, look, it can be a contributing cause. I don't know that it's the cause of all gun violence, but it can certainly contribute. They stop at legislation at the state or local level to keep the mental from connecting to the metal. Everyone who is mentally healthy has the civil right to own firearms. But the rub here is who gets to decide who is mentally healthy? See, that's something that could be very easily abused. In fact, if you look back on the history of psychiatry, for many years, psychiatry was the punitive arm of the state, just figuring out how to get rid of people who were inconvenient or embarrassing to the ruling regime. For crying out loud, the Soviet Union, they would declare people mentally, unhealthy and send them off to re-education camps or to the gulag where they could get their thinking straight. The bottom line is, if you want to prevent people from owning firearms, all you have to do is deem, well, anybody who believes that there was any question about the 2020 election, they're mentally unhealthy. Now, I realize there are a lot on the left who'd pile right on that. Oh, of course, that's what we believe. Anybody who believes in God, mentally unhealthy. What they're missing here and what they need to realize is that natural rights do not depend upon consensus. They don't depend upon government permission. They exist prior to and in spite of whatever man-made laws may be. The Second Amendment was never about hunting. It was never about sport shooting. It's all about protecting oneself from tyranny, whether that is from the tyranny of a criminal assaulting you or your family or a government that does not recognize the limits to its power. I know it's an ugly topic and nobody really wants to talk about it, but we seem to be pushed and we're being forced into a corner where the real reason for this is going to be drawn out. If you want to get better informed about firearms and their role in society, the best thing I can recommend is actually go out and spend some time learning about gun safety, spend some time on the shooting range. You may still say, you know what, this isn't for me. But at least it'll take some of the mystery out of it and hopefully will dispel some of the myths that say, there's no place for this in a civilized society. I think if people were serious about gun control, the first place they would start is in disarming the agents of the government, because that's where the greatest amount of harm is likely to come from. And one final thought on this, the very same people who are pushing and screaming for gun control right now, just a few months ago, were the same people who were pushing for people like you and me to be cast out of society, denied our jobs, denied housing, denied service in stores or restaurants, because we wouldn't get a forced medical procedure in the form of a vaccine. Are you sure those are the kind of people you can trust to have your best interests at heart? Because I'm having some real problems with what they're asking of us, or more appropriately, telling us. All right, shifting gears. Now let's get to something that's not as controversial. You probably noticed it's Pride Month. I mean, how could anybody miss it? And there's a situation that is shaping up in northern Idaho, particularly in Coeur d'Alene. This is the Pride in the Park celebration coming up this Saturday in Coeur d'Alene. And you notice it's a family-friendly celebration of LGBTQ+ and diversity. Now, I don't want to appeal to your sense of outrage here. I think it's much more important that we are known for who we are, what we stand for, than simply what we're against. But what I would like to suggest is that there are people who are very active right now in the Coeur d'Alene area who are very much opposed to this force feeding of everything rainbow colored. They don't want to be fitted for a set of rainbow prescription glasses. And there were at least a couple of individuals who stood up and said, well, it's time for us to take this fight, and take it directly to the people who are pushing this. I'm going to suggest that there may be a better approach than this. And you feel free to disagree. You don't have to agree with this at all, but please hear me out. The people who are putting on these pride festivals are backed by the bulk of the social justice warrior community. And that means that they will have the likes of Antifa and Black Lives Matter and other very activist direct action groups who like to go out there and provoke reactions from people. They like to go out and start fights. And if you saw the rioting from a couple of years ago, you know, the Proud Boys were out there duking it out with them in the streets. This is not the place to fight that battle because it's on their turf. The media is going to be there in large numbers. They are going to be primed and looking for anybody that can be portrayed as, you know, that domestic extremist that is somehow, you know, there to cause trouble and to fulfill that you know, prophecy of, oh, look at this, you know, these are the people who are threatening our democracy. Don't play into the hands of the people who want a fight. The best thing that you and I can do is let them have their party in the park. Now, granted, look, I don't like to see children being introduced and indoctrinated into this kind of stuff. I think it's wrong. I'm going to explain more about that in just a few moments. But I do want to say that when they go out there looking for a reaction, if you give them a reaction, they're getting what they want. Deny them an audience. Deny them the reaction that they're so adamant that they get. Deny them the reason to fight. It's a puddle of gasoline that is just looking for a spark, and the thing that is not needed right now is more friction. Let them have their party. Let them do it without you. Don't participate in what they're doing. I also wanted to introduce you to an idea that this is not just a matter of, you know, personal preference. It's not just a matter of, well, you know, you're here to spoil all their fun. If you look at this from the standpoint of, you know, this focus on everything is sexualized and pleasure seeking is the most important thing in life. So important, in fact, that we have to teach it to kids at the earliest possible age. I want to recommend a book that very few people have ever heard of. It's called Sex and Culture, published in 1934 by a British anthropologist by the name of J.D. Unwin. In particular, what Unwin was doing was testing the thesis of Sigmund Freud that civilization is born out of repressed sexuality. So what he did was he studied 86 different societies, great and small, including the Anglo-Saxons, the Romans, the Greeks, the Sumerians, and the Moors. And in addition to these historical giants, he also studied smaller civilizations, right down to tiny South Sea islands. This is the conclusion he came to. I'm going to read it directly. In human records, there is no instance of a society retaining its energy after a complete new generation has inherited a tradition which does not insist on prenuptial and postnuptial continence. Now, I'm going to put this in plain language. Societies flourish during those times when they practice strict sexual fidelity. They decline when their sexual mores are loose. Now, he didn't set out to do this from the standpoint of, I'm going to go out and show that right is wrong and this is righteousness and that is wickedness. He had no moral or religious conclusion that he was trying to get to. He was simply looking at the data, and he could not find a single society, without exception, that didn't go into decline when they made pleasure-seeking or hedonism their highest goal. Take from that what you will, but it's worth looking into what he's saying and realize that a lot of the confusion being foisted on us today is taking us in an entirely different direction than we could or should be going. So a couple of positive thoughts as I close this up. If you haven't heard of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, this is a guy that you should probably hear about. Actually, I'm going to skip this slide because I want to get right to the good stuff here. The simple step of a courageous individual is not to partake in the lie. One word of truth outweighs the whole world. When you're invited to repeat the lie or to participate in the lie or to bend your knee and put on your rainbow pin and pretend that this is all good and proper, you can simply refuse to do so. Better still, you can be the kind of person whose impeccable behavior and conduct puts you above reproach. Solzhenitsyn also made the comment, it is a universal law, intolerance is the first sign of an inadequate education. An ill-educated person behaves with arrogant impatience, whereas truly profound education breeds humility. I want you to pay close attention to the people who are most intolerant of anybody who dissents from their point of view. It's not the folks who are out there claiming the manual of tolerance. It's the people who are out there trying to promote diversity and trying to promote, uniformity of thought in which you and I cannot dissent. Know who you are. Know what you stand for. Live up to that truth, and you'll do a lot more good than simply going and butting heads with people who are determined to pick a fight with you. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
Indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see.
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.